All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, land of plaid and coffee, and PacWest Bigfoot. And real quick, getting back into doing some interviews here pretty soon with some folks, and I've got one coming out this next week from Joshua Calhoun, the writer of When They Kill. So you're gonna really love that. It's a really cool book. Anyways, I'll put that out there next week. Real quick. Wanted to say Merry Christmas to you. It is Christmas time. Merry Christmas. And guess what? If you're up around the Dallas, Oregon area and you haven't gotten your Christmas tree, well, why don't you try out Bigfoot Christmas trees? As a matter of fact, you can check it out, look them up. You can find them out there. As a matter of fact, there's a little comments on the last post on my Facebook, and you can find that they left a comment there. You can get to their Facebook page from there, but it's up in Dallas, Oregon. Bigfoot Christmas trees. Get on up there. Hey, a little shout out for you guys over there who are loving Bigfoot's wilderness. I just wanted to say I told you so. Mike does a real awesome job out there. It's just really, really great. And thank you, Mike, for all of your hard work at out there at Bigfoot's wilderness. And of course, if you have a coffee lover, this is a free promo right here. I'm not kidding. If you have a coffee lover out there, Sasquatch Coffee Company, squatchcoffee.com. Get over there, grab yourself a couple, 2, 3 bags and give them to your loved ones who love that coffee. I know one thing, you know me. I got my coffee right here. I do. So squatchcoffee.com, and no matter what, guys, Merry Christmas to you, and a Happy New Year. Literally, a Happy New Year to you too. So let's get on to this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. This is called The Christmas Cabin and Bigfoot. It was ransacked, to say the least. The cabin we'd been using Christmas that year. The family cabin had been broken into and torn up pretty good. But we never expected a Bigfoot to be the culprit, nor have such a frightening experience with it. It was crazy when you learn something like this really does exist, even when you've heard the stories you thought were just that, stories. But that Christmas, well, Bigfoot joined us and has stuck with us ever since. The Christmas Cabin. The wife and I love Christmas, and back in 2003, after all the craziness in the world were finally settling down a bit, and the world seemed to be righting itself once again after being rocked so hard with such evil and hate, we decided we would open up the family cabin for a huge family Christmas gathering that year. We would invite all the family we could, spread out throughout the Pacific Northwest, and my brother and his family who live back east. It would be a great time for all of us to return to a place our parents had not only lived out the rest of their lives until passing on, but the home away from home for the whole family. It was built by my parents, who of course started their family later than most. They lived pretty long lives though, and I think my mother departed because she missed our dad, her husband, the love of her life. We all believed that when she passed on in her sleep one night peacefully. She just wanted to go home to be with the Lord and her beloved husband. Who knows? I thought stranger things have happened, and I know that for a fact. It had been years since we had all been there together, probably about 12 or so to be exact. Why so long? Well, lives moved on after my parents died, and we seemed to have accepted that they were the glue that kept us together, and now that glue was gone. So after many years, each of us seemed to have gone our own way. Even I moved out of state to a small town along the Oregon coast to teach. My older brother joined the military and was, at the time of the incident, a part of the Desert Storm, and now home and safe with his family on a base back east. I wanted to, personally speaking, reapply the glue that bound us together. I missed my siblings, and my wife missed hers. And after all that happened a few years before, we thought it'd be a great time to apply that glue again, at least as much as possible. So with the decision made, we knew we had to get the cabin ready, and ready nearly for 8 adults and about 8 kids. What a busy mess we were creating for ourselves. But the idea of everyone together again was well worth it. So, the day after Thanksgiving that year, we headed south to the old cabin in the woods between Crescent City and False Klamath, Oregon, California. Ransacked. It is not all that far, but a couple of hours or a bit more to get there from where we currently live to the cabin. At the time, we had no kids, but that would change for us a year later. Like my parents, we were waiting a bit longer than most. We were planners, after all. Finally, we reached the cabin. It was ransacked, to say the least. The cabin we'd be using for Christmas that year, the family cabin, had been broken into and torn up pretty good. It is not as if things were unrepairable by any means, and it just seemed as if someone went through the place, knocking things over and off the walls. The refrigerator was tipped over, though, and 2 cupboards were hanging by their hinges and one completely torn off. The old pictures on the living room walls were all over the floor, and the ones in the hallway were down. The doors to some of the rooms were, scratched up, and it seemed like wild animal claws were raked against them. A black bear, we believed, had gotten in, and we found where it did, the back door. It was ripped almost completely off its hinges as well, hanging by the lower one, only inches off the porch. And again, claw marks were found all over it. Neither of us thought anything more about it, other than being a black bear, getting in and tearing up the place. So with that, we got to work cleaning up the mess it had left behind. We had a whole 3 weeks off for vacation, some time saved up, and we would use it all to get things in order at the old cabin and ready for the rest of the family. Everyone was coming. Even my brother and his family from back east were booked with flights and heading out in a week. He too had some leave time available, would use 2 weeks of it for this one trip. He has always been a great big brother, that's for sure. I fixed the door to the cupboards the same day as my wife cleaned up the rest of the mess that was strewn about. The furniture was mostly tipped over but unharmed for the most part. But those doors, they had to be replaced for sure, as well as the refrigerator. I actually joked with my wife about leaving the doors as is and seeing the looks on the faces of my nieces and nephews as they would see the claw marks. But of course, that was just a joke. We had some of the life insurance money still in savings, and the next day I was driving up the coastline to get new doors, while Sue stayed back at the cabin and continued cleaning up. It would take me over an hour to collect them and get back to the cabin. All the way there, and all the way back, I started thinking of some of the inconsistencies of all the mess being caused by a black bear. I mean, that door was practically ripped off, and that refrigerator was the old school heavy ones that were not easy to move, especially when they fit snug tight between a wall and a large counter. I kept tossing things over in my mind as I drove, and what was on the walls were knocked off, and why? Well, that was a problem this math teacher was having in his head. Things were simply not, adding up. Being watched. The rest of the evening was all about replacing the doors, especially the back door. Fortunately, the cabin, or what was a house we grew up in back in the day, was all log, and the front and back door were of light wood color, not painted, just weather-coated and sealed wood for the most part. Of course, the bedroom doors and the bathroom door needed to be painted over, a sort of off-white color. Fortunately, I picked that up too in town. It took us most of the late afternoon and into the early hours of the night to get most of it done. That is when the weirdness, I guess you'd call it, started in. My wife had the radio playing. It had survived being tossed across the room near the fireplace, but she listened to it and, from time to time, looked outside into the darkness. I noticed her staring outside and into nothing, and for a second, she shivered and turned around when she saw my reflection in the window, and with a bit of fright, too. I asked what was wrong, and she said, and I quote, "Honey, I feel like I'm being watched. I don't know why. I just feel like it is all," she said, and started rubbing her arms up and down as if she were cold. She was not cold. She was basically a bit nervous and chilled to the bone, I suppose, with the feeling of being watched. I shut the curtains, started a fire, and decided we should call it a night on the cleaning up and have something to eat by the fire. Not a few minutes after shutting the curtains did she feel comfortable again, and the rest of the night went on as any other night in the cabin or house I grew up in, quiet and cozy. Owls don't do that. It snowed. It did. Not that that was abnormal for that time of year, but snow at Christmas and around Christmas that close to the Pacific Ocean was not an every year occurrence, that was for sure. The climate a bit further inland, yeah, but within such a short distance to the ocean, not usually do we see any more than a dusting here and there, if we're lucky. But there was a dusting and a bit more. That was the reason I was shaken to death by Sue as she was trying to wake me up. I was a bit groggy, but I swear she was trying to get me up and that it was for some significant reason. I sat up finally, and she was demanding I go outside with her. It was the snow that happened through the night. It was not the snow that happened through the night. It was a series of impressions in it that had her a bit frantic and, well, afraid, to be honest. I was in my robe, pajama bottoms, and t-shirt and boots, staring at what looked like, I guess, footprints, large ones. But apparently the snow had become a rainy drizzle for the last half hour, and all I could make out was an outline of each one with no real definition to it. As far as I was concerned, it was a large black bear, a huge one, outside during the evening, and was now wondering who had invaded its home, the cabin. It, I had decided, moved on into the woods above the cabin and would probably not return, knowing people were now about the property. If only that were true. The same night, sounds from outside tingled our ears as we ate dinner together on the back patio. The patio is a raised patio sitting on concrete blocks. It's about 20 feet by 15 and made of redwood, actually. My father did a bang-up job on the cabin and all the wood he chose for it. It really is a beautiful and picturesque cabin in the woods, so to speak. But we sat there enjoying some homemade pizza my wife makes from scratch. Apparently, the smell of it started attracting animals and birds that evening. It started with what sounded like an owl, but it did not hoot as the typical owl sounds like. No, this was more of a screechy sounding owl, if there ever was one. It was rather spooky sounding too, my wife had commented. It echoed throughout the hillside. See, the porch stepped down into a flat area that was no wider than maybe 5 or 6 feet. From there, it was all hillside, or a mountain, more like it. It led up. The trees and shrubs were thick. Of course, this was the Pacific Northwest coastal mountain range after all, and while the legends of Bigfoot were known to us in all my years here, and my wife's in the Pacific Northwest, not once had we seen or discovered Bigfoot or the evidence of these legends to us at the time ever. But the screeching got me to thinking as we sat there. One would screech here, then another one from the opposite direction. Again another that seemed to come from the front of the house, well, in that direction. Not from the front yard or anything like that, just from the front. They came, then they came, they answered, they echoed, and they were gone. Suddenly, it just stopped. We felt kind of, weirded out about the situation. The spookiness of the sounds added to this weird feeling, so we decided to have dessert inside that evening and stay inside too. Again, my wife shut the large curtains over the living room's picture windows that were not broken during the siege on the house, miraculously. But she did. She shut them with that feeling running through her again of being watched. With that, I decided to stay awake that night and do a little investigation. It's so quiet here. I stayed up with a bit of help from a few cups of coffee my wife made. A nice little fire to keep me warm, and yes, another pleasure and guilt-filled slice of the practice pumpkin pie she was going to make later that week when the family would pile in. I kept the lights off, the fire to a minimum, and left the outside lights, minus a street light at the far edge of the driveway I had not yet figured out how to control, or even if I could at all. But I left them on and sat back and stared out into the dark, past the edges of the light and into the shadows. It was quiet. Too quiet. I was not sure at first, but I noticed a shadow of sorts, a shape, if you will, that seemed to, at least it looked, a lot like a figure, like a human-shaped figure standing just outside the light and just inside the trees. It was starting to snow again, but lightly. This made it a bit more difficult to tell what I was seeing, but I kept focusing on it. I noticed the wind had died down. The snowfall was making that fact extremely noticeable, as the snow was literally falling and straight down practically. But that shape, that figure in the shadows, now it seemed to be moving back and forth as if it were a person swaying in the trees. I started getting excited, nervous, and a sense of fear followed all of that, making me feel, well, suddenly worried, very worried. I sat my pie back down and decided to move myself a bit closer to the window and shade the light coming from the driveway from my eyes just a bit. It was a figure, a giant, dark, and suddenly menacing figure with greenish eyes reflecting the light and swaying back and forth, just staring. I believed it was staring in my direction, or at least at the cabin. Could they see me? Was it actually a person or something else? For a moment, I thought the bear was standing there on its two legs, wondering if it was safe to come across to the house and ransack it again. But another part of me said, no, this is not a bear. As a matter of fact, my inside was screaming that this was not a bear. And it was not. There are moments in your life when that inner voice is spot on. And you know that what is about to transpire you can neither avoid nor want to avoid in some weird way. This was one of those moments. I watched as it slowly moved forward. I knew well, and I had a feeling it could not see me, but I could see it. And it was stealthy despite the fact. But as a ghost would wisp about, this thing moved from one tree to the other, then forward, out into the light, and into my mind forever. I literally shuddered, then froze, then tried to call for my wife, but the words failed me. I was staring at a beast, a monster, a massive, hairy, ape-like creature I knew at the moment was Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, if you will. Its eyes were literally green, brilliant green, constantly glinting against the light that came from the lamp at the end of the driveway. It stopped, hunched down, and seemed to, as my heart started to fail because of it, but it seemed to be looking right at me, as if in fact it could see me. I tried to mouth the name, but I could not get the word out. I could not call out for my wife by name. However, I did not have to. It scared me, but she grabbed my hand and stood next to me as we both looked at each other briefly and then back at that Bigfoot. Without warning, it screamed. Literally, it leaned forward and let out a scream that had us both turning on all the lights and me going for the rifle. I had to get rid of this thing. I knew I had to try at least to scare it off. I ran out the front door, aimed in the direction of where I saw it, and fired. However, I was still so freaked out that I caught myself shooting at thin air. The Bigfoot was gone. I know that was not smart, but we were in the woods basically, and I just seen a monster. I'm sure you'd do the same if it happened to you. Again, a scream, but this time from far up in the back of the house, way up the hillside it came, and I let out a breath that I thought I'd been holding for nearly 10 minutes or so. My sister's story. It took us about 2 days to finally get the nerve to hike around the property armed, of course, and seeing if this thing was still around. We saw no sign, heard no more sounds in the night, nor had we the feeling of being watched any longer. Soon enough, the family finally started pouring in over the next couple of days, and it was nice to have them there, all of them. At first, we kept what happened to us to ourselves, but my sister noticed the paint and the new doors. She also noticed the back door and some other things that seemed, out of place or new. With that, we had a long talk on Christmas Eve with all of them about what transpired. And to our surprise, my sister and my brother were not surprised in the least. And just so you know, they have their own story of this Bigfoot and this cabin they want to share with you soon. But until then, Merry Christmas, Caleb.